I'm Lindsey Wu. So I'm going to focus my talk on R&D around neglected diseases. So just briefly, I'm going to talk first on what are global trends and investments in this area. Second, I'm going to discuss a few business models that are very interesting in the field. And finally, touch on challenges and solutions for the future. So just a little bit on Policy Cures. We're a very small think tank that focuses on policies around neglected disease pharmaceuticals. We're based in Sydney and London, and our aim is to accelerate the development and uptake of products for the developing world. So the first bit I'm going to talk about on investments largely come from a project we did for the Gates Foundation, which was called the G-Finder Survey. And the G-Finder Survey was a 5-year-long survey trying to track global investments in R&D specifically for neglected diseases. And we tracked 31 different diseases, and the criteria for being included in the survey were first, that it had to disproportionately affect developing countries. Second, that there was a need for new products, so it wasn't purely about access on the ground. And third, that there was a market failure, that there was an insufficient commercial market. So what we found in the last 5 years is that about approximately 2.5 to 3.3 billion has been invested per year in neglected disease R&D. And we're still seeing inequalities between the different diseases. So we see a high concentration of the funding going to 3 diseases, HIV, malaria, and tuberculosis. Then there's a second tier of diseases that are receiving about 1 to 8% of the pie. Some of these are semi-commercial diseases, which I'll discuss later on industry involvement. And then we have the third tier, which are truly neglected diseases. They're receiving less than 1% of the funding in the field. So I guess the key question here, to throw out some provocative questions, is what drives this? Is it advocacy and activism? Is it technical feasibility? And whether or not funding in this area is a zero-sum game or not. So is the question about reallocating funds between the diseases, or is it about growing the pie bigger? Is it about targeting the investments to areas where you're going to get better value for money? So this is a lot of the concepts that we discuss in the G-Finder reports. The second thing is who is funding neglected disease R&D. And we're still finding that the public sector, so high-income countries and multilaterals, are still funding the large majority of the research in this area. But the caveat to that is that the trends there are that they're funding domestic universities and research institutions. So we see that philanthropies and the private sector do play a large role, and those tend to be the sectors that are funding later stage product development. And if you look into the G-Finder report, you'll be able to see more of the trends year to year, but that's quite a lot of detail to go into here. But so as we move forward, the questions are, what role will industry play in global health? What types of diseases are they investing in, and what stage are they investing in? So at an organizational level, we see that the NIH is still by far the largest funder, followed by the Gates Foundation, and then the pharmaceutical industry. And in the survey, we had to aggregate pharma data for confidentiality reasons. So it might be kind of strange to see them as an organizational funder, but that's why it's up there. But the key takeaway from this is that across all the 5 years of the G-Finder survey, we saw a high concentration of funding amongst just a few organizations. So the NIH provided 40% of total neglected disease funding, the Gates 17%, and industry was 14%. So going forward, given the financial crisis, what that means in terms of risks, if one organization pulls out or changes its direction, particularly the Gates Foundation or the NIH, what does that actually mean for the field? So now I'm going to talk about a few interesting business models that have emerged in global health in the last decade. The first one is product development partnerships, or PDPs, and I think now they're changing their name to nonprofit research organizations to get a larger umbrella. But essentially PDPs were created in the last decade to address the market failure in this field, products and diseases that weren't being addressed by the public sector or industry. And they've matured a lot in the last decade, so they've been involved in 40% of the new global health products delivered in the last decade. And I'll discuss some interesting examples of that a bit later. And the next is innovative developing countries, which is a term we created in the G-Finder survey, but really we've surveyed a few of the BRICS countries. Primarily we've gotten data from Brazil, India, and South Africa. And the new trend here is that there's a large amount of government investment in domestic biotech innovation. So, for example, South Africa, they've developed a center called the H3D. And so this is a drugs discovery and development center that is supported by the South African Department of Science and the Technology Innovation Agency. And the idea with the H3D is that they're going to test and develop preclinical drug candidates. And at the same time, they're going to train African scientists to develop a critical mass of personnel to attract industry investment into South Africa. So this is quite interesting because it reflects this emphasis of technology transfer from high-income countries into South Africa. So they're partnering with a few key institutions. One of them is Tres Cantos with GSK. Another one is Novartis. They're also partnering with a couple of the PDPs, so the Medicines for Malaria Venture is one, and the TB Alliance, as well as some public institutions, the NIH and the Swiss Tropical and Public Health Institute. So here we see South Africa trying to bring in this knowledge domestically, but really to create the capacity on the ground to address the health needs of their own populations. Another interesting example is India. So the Department of Biotechnology has been really pivotal in supporting biotech industry. And the pharmaceutical industry in India has really matured from a place where they're really focusing on generics to now increasingly having the capacity to develop novel products. So some examples of the government movements here are the grants for the Small Business Innovation Research Initiative, and this is to fund biotechs for early stage pre-proof of concept type projects. The second is the Biotechnology Industry Partnership Program. And the key here is to fund breakthrough research that can actually create IP rights within India. So this is really interesting because the DBT wants to create IP ownership for India and increase the competitiveness of the Indian pharmaceutical market. They've also funded, like you mentioned, incubator parks and science parks within India. So those are interesting movements. So I'm just going to touch on a couple of examples of successful innovations that have occurred in the last 10 years. And I won't discuss all of them because they're quite detailed. But the first one is Manafravac. And these examples all represent very successful collaborations in the field across sectors and organizations and countries. So Manafravac was a conjugate vaccine against meningitis A, which was the strain that was responsible for 85% of the meningitis epidemic within Africa. So compared to old vaccines, the new vaccine was able to protect infants, was long-lasting after one dose, and prevented transmission. And another key factor of this product was that the price for Manafravac was less than 50 cents a dose. So this was a price that was set by African governments as an affordable price for them. And that was a key breakthrough because previous vaccines were set at $80 to $100 a dose that was developed by Novartis and Sanofi. And Manafravac was also developed at less than half the time of a normal vaccine. So it was quite a good global health success story. And this was possible because, well, first the Gates Foundation provided a 10-year grant for the meningitis vaccine program, which was a collaboration between the PDP PATH and the WHO. But they also brought in the Serum Institute of India, which was an Indian manufacturer that was able to produce the vaccine at a lesser cost than any of the Western developers were able to agree to. Also, the FDA was involved. They helped to facilitate the technology transfer for the conjugate technology. So all of these different collaborations across these sectors helped to really make this a very smooth transition. And in 2010, the vaccine was actually ready for rollout, and it was registered first in India. So that was also an interesting breakthrough, that it didn't go to a Western regulatory agency first. So actually I won't touch, maybe we can talk on some of these other examples later, but Expert TB is also an example of a partnership between FIND, which is a PDP diagnostic organization, and they work with CEPHID to develop a diagnostic for TB. So on the ground, a lot of health impact has been enabled by these products. So this is just an example of some of the stats on rollout of Manafravac. And some of the projected averted deaths and disabilities from these projects. So there have been successes in the last 10 years, but going forward, what are the challenges? Well, at the moment, there are still a number of products in the pipeline, and a lot of them are facing financial austerity risks. So the key challenges here are that development times are very long, and as we've seen in previous talks, the science in this area is very, very risky. But the alternative is that political timelines are very short. So how do we make sure we match sustainable funding from governments and donors and not having it run out before these pipelines hit their most expensive stages. So targeted funding is really important at this point. And here I've put the number of candidates in different stages of R&D, and this is really important because as candidates reach late-stage trials, this is probably where a lot of the funding needs to ramp up. At the same time, we don't want to take our eye off the ball, so basic research and translational research feeds this pipeline. So government donors and philanthropies need to be very aware of this and target the funding according to portfolio development timelines. Another issue that a lot of researchers have mentioned is that funding is very fragmented. Well, there's really two issues. On one hand, there's high concentration of funding, which means your portfolio funding could be very risky if one donor decides to change their funding patterns. But on the second hand, when there is diversification of funders, they're not very coordinated. So researchers are having to go and look for different pots of money, and they're spending all of their time looking for these grants rather than focusing on the science and actually producing the goods. So those are the main issues that need to be addressed going forward, given the financial pressures. So just to sum up, this is just a image of all the different elements that would go into delivering impact from R&D in neglected diseases. And that includes developing capacity on the ground in developing countries, as well as collaborations and partnerships.
Thank you very much, Lindsey.